Well, good evening. I'm very pleased to be with you here this evening. Glad you all have come for our 57th Institute for Ethics in Journalism. I'm Art Brisbane. I'm the visiting night chair for journalism ethics. And tonight we're offering, as I say, the 57th installment of this institute. It was begun by Professor Lou Hodges, continued by Professor Edward Wasserman, and has for many years now created twice annual opportunities for W&L students to interact with leading professional figures. For our 57th, we're privileged to have on campus, in addition to our speaker today, whom I will introduce in a few moments, 7 working professionals from various segments of the media. Our Ethics Institute Fellows are here to present and discuss cases in media ethics with the 18 students in my Journalism 345 class this term, with seminars taking place today and tomorrow. What I'd like to do now is introduce each fellow, and I'll ask you to hold your applause until I'm finished. So fellows, please stand when I introduce you. Here with us this weekend are Michelle Boniface St. John. Michelle, thank you. She's an associate producer with CBS 60 Minutes, and she's a member of the class of 2009. Ellen Foley, a colleague of mine in times gone by, who's Senior Vice President of Corporate Communications for WPS, Wisconsin's leading not-for-profit health insurer. Kayla Harmon, another alumna, class of 2005, the Public Relations and Government Affairs Manager for Columbia Metropolitan Airport. Karen Grau, founder and chief executive of Calamari Productions, a documentary filmmaker. Glenn Proctor, Glenn, where are you? Glenn, development officer for the Charlotte Observer and a former visiting journalism professor here at W&L. Laurel McLeod, senior vice president for Pursuant, the Pursuant Group, a consulting firm, and also an alumna. Thank you for coming. And finally, Edward Schumacher Matos, the ombudsman for NPR, National Public Radio. So please give our ethics fellows a good welcome. Now, in the interest of time, I'm not going to introduce all of them, but I would like all the students in my 345 class to stand and be recognized. Will you all please stand? All right, thank you. And finally, I'd like to thank the one person who makes this event run smoothly every year, with many duties on her list, keeping me in line, being at the top of it, overseeing all the logistics, the hospitality, the venues, the Institute's sentinel in general, Joan Millen, assistant to the night chair. Here we go, Joan. Okay. The Ethics Institute every winter focuses on a broad spectrum of communication arts, not just journalism, but also advertising, public relations, strategic communications, documentary filmmaking, and more. Because the mix of communications is quite broad, the ethical considerations are a bit more complex to sort through. What is considered a clear ethical requirement for a marketing professional, for example, may be ethically problematic for a journalist, and vice versa. The duties, obligations, mix of stakeholders, these will vary, though the deeper principles of ethics remain a constant. And there's more to it than that. The digital revolution has played havoc with traditional practices and has introduced whole new forms for media professionals to understand and use. Beyond the challenges presented by the technologies themselves, there's the additional problem that rapid change requires quick adoption, and thoughtful consideration of ethics is sometimes lost in the rush. Fortunately, we have with us someone today who can offer a view from the front lines, that is, from an emerging media form that simply did not exist a few short years ago, brand publishing. But first, I must pause to let you know that we do have a change in the program. Our scheduled speaker, whose face you've come to know and love on the posters all around town, Shane Snow, has come down with strep throat and mononucleosis. Yeah, and his doctor told him he would be contagious through Saturday. So we said, well, we want you to look out for yourself, Sean, and, we'll see you next year. Fortunately, a colleague of Shane has agreed to step into the breach and speak to us on our topic. What happens to ethics when the advertisers write the stories? So it's my pleasure, and I say this with great relief as well, to introduce John Hazard, the Director of Client Services at Contently, a New York-based startup that is charting the course of brand publishing, or brand journalism. Thank you, John, for being willing to come here on such short notice. Don't come up just yet. We're very, very appreciative. John is someone who has successfully navigated the digital revolution, beginning his career in a traditional niche and working today in a groundbreaking one. John has been a reporter and editor for more than a decade, covering technology, the legal profession, and crime. He served on a team that won the 2004 Selden Ring Award, a prestigious journalism honor, for an investigation of New Jersey elected officials exploiting their positions for personal gain. Some things never change. John started his career in 2000 on the obituary desk at the Asbury Park Press in New Jersey before moving on to work for the Metro desk in the courts and in the State House Bureau. He became the managing editor of Night and Day magazine, a local news and entertainment magazine covering suburban New York, where he launched an online edition. In addition, John previously was a reporter and later news editor at Ziff Davis, a global digital media company, where he oversaw eweek.com and was also web editor of American Lawyer. His first foray into brand journalism was in 2008 at The Ladders, a job matching service and employment website, where he was the news editor on a team of 3 who turned a weekly email from the CEO into a news and features site that told a compelling story about the plight of American job seekers. Please help me welcome John Hazard.
Bear with me a second, folks. Well, first I want to say that I am in an ethical quandary put here by the Ethics Institute and ART because I'm standing between all of you and happy hour. Just really an unfortunate position to be in. All right, I'm mic'd up. Am I good? All right. So I wanted to start today by breaking with one of the rules of presenting, which is to show you a weakness right off the bat. When you present and speak publicly, you're supposed to take a position, build an argument that supports that position, and ensure that it's the right one and convey that message. I'm going to tell you right off the bat that I have a vested interest in that position. And that should be my vulnerability to you as the audience. I work for a company that's deeply tied to brand publishing. I have a vested interest in believing it and making it true. I'm also a believer. So I sit up here and I get very excited and passionate and I put on my advocate's hat. But I am at my core a journalist. So at the end of the day, I am generally skeptical. And I hope as you're listening to me today, I hope I'm not full of crap, but I hope you view me as journalists and bring a little skepticism to this. Today, so we're going to talk about brand publishing, and it's known by a whole bunch of names. It's known by content marketing, native advertising, and brand journalism, which is the one that's maybe the goofiest and the one we like the least. But as we call it, it's brand publishing. And inbound marketing, custom content, sponsored content. It's known by a zillion different names. Let's look at some examples. The Red Bulletin. This is probably one of the bigger sites out there. Red Bull no longer considers itself a drink company. It now considers itself a media company that happens to make money by selling juice in a can. American Express publishes Open Forum. This is a Contently client, I'll tell you that too. They are the largest small business media site going, entirely brought to you by American Express. They've got a vested interest in everyone who lands on this site, but they are one of the leading publishers of small business news and info. And UPS, which is publishing, this is publishing through Forbes, but UPS is publishing a zillion bits of content a month on on the topic of logistics, trying to reach an audience that cares about running their businesses properly. And everyone has a blog, social media account in which they're trying to spew forth their brand story. Oreo, we all know their Super Bowl story. So why would a brand want to be a publisher? And more importantly, how can a brand be a publisher? Used to be that if you wanted to reach an audience, it was a very limited set that could do that. It was printers and broadcasters. And broadcasters often get forgotten when we talk about this brand publishing concept because that's still a very new territory. But there were two ways to reach the audience. You had to own a printing press, you had to have union workers, you had to have delivery routes, you had to have a transmission license, transmission equipment, not to mention the reporters in the field and people producing the paper and the news that filled it every day. The web blew all that up. It said you no longer had to have this expensive transmission equipment, no longer had to have that broadcast license, you no longer had to have those delivery routes. Anyone could, if they paid for the hosting fee, could start a website and start publishing to the web immediately. So it blew that up, and it invited companies like UPS, American Express, and Red Bulletin to become publishers. So we want to ask today, what happens when the advertisers are telling the stories? What happens to the ethics of journalism? That's the question I'm going to address today. Real quickly, I'll tell you a little bit about Contently's story and my own. So Contently was founded by three fellows. One of them was Shane Snow. We're 4 years old now. Shane was graduating from Columbia Journalism School, the most employable, esteemed journalist in the world, perhaps. 150, 400 of them every year come out of that school, and they were finding a really dim employment market. They were all looking to graduate with this very expensive, valuable degree, and all going into careers as freelancers right out of school. It was pretty daunting and scary to Shane and all his friends coming out. So he looked at brokering a better deal for freelancers. After spending a year on his own being a freelancer, he started to look at being the go-between between freelancers and publishers. If you've ever had to be a freelancer, you know the nightmare that is running to get your next job, begging people to pay you for the job you did last. If you've ever worked with freelancers, you know the nightmare is paying people, rounding up freelancers. It's a bit of a herding cats operation. So Shane built a company, Contently, and basically operated a bit like an agency. And the goal was to go out to media companies and broker the freelance arrangement with them. Problem was media companies were very cheap. At the time, media companies were willing to pay 5 and 10 cents a word. Things like $50 for a 500-word story. It really wasn't a way to build a company for Shane, and it wasn't a way to create a living for freelance journalists coming out of school. I'll give you a bit of my background there too, because I was on a bit of a parallel journey, which Art alluded to. I was working at a company, Ziff Davis, and we were a traditional publisher. We reached 500,000-600,000 print subscribers a week. We had several million page views a week. Strong audience, but the advertising dollars were dipping away, and we just kept bleeding the stone. We looked for someone to buy the company. And an unlikely source came to the rescue that didn't ultimately pan out, but it forced us to ask some questions about a brand as a publisher. A company called Ingram Micro approached us about buying Ziff Davis, buying this title of magazines to reach their customers directly. Ingram Micro, if you don't know it, sells high-end computer equipment to companies, IBM, Cisco, Microsoft, Apple, any high-end systems. They said, we're spending millions of dollars a year to reach this audience through Ziff Davis. We're paying Ziff Davis millions of dollars. Let's just acquire it, and we'll reach this advertising will be free. We might sell advertising to other companies on the side, but basically we'll have a straight route to that audience. That forced us to think about the ethics. We're that much closer to the sponsor. We used to have that advertising salesperson between us and the company buying the ad. Now the company buying the ad is actually paying our salaries. They told us that if they bought the company, people make promises, but they said they didn't value a volume business. They valued a really close relationship to the audience, and to do so, they needed to produce a high quality journalism product. They promised to double down on the journalism product that was being offered. Sounded great to me. A little later, I got an offer to go to this company, The Ladders, where we were trying to do just that. We were trying to tell the story of the American job search in 2008 when it was really tough out there for a company that was trying to make money by connecting job seekers to recruiters. So we're on these parallel journeys. I joined Contently in 2011. It's flown by. At that point, we changed track, and we changed from going after media companies that had very little money, and we decided to approach brands. We became a software company that taught brands how to build a newsroom, how to connect with journalists, how to operate journalists in the field, and how to pay them, which was a critical piece. The other thing we did, we set some standards, and we were able to hold the price point fairly high. The nice thing that we discovered along the way is that brands were fairly willing to pay. They needed a high quality product, just like Ingram Micro. They cared a lot about the talent and the product of journalism they were going to connect with and put out. So, and more about Contently, we grew. Today we're 30,000 writers in the field. We have 50 plus enterprise brands. We do still work with media companies. We have about a dozen major media companies working with us, from Forbes to Slate to Gawker, blanking on some more. We just did a round of funding. We're a venture-backed startup. We have $11 million in funding. So this isn't just a fun project of ours. The market sees value in it. And every time we've gone to raise funds, we've seen a good return from the market. As we felt our way around the media landscape and trying to build this idea of brand journalism, we felt a little bit like we were exploring the moon with a flashlight, which is why we have this slide here. We were a bit lost, and we were on our own. I had done it before at The Ladders, but on a very small scale, and we were being approached by very large companies who wanted to do this. And they were turning to us and asking, how do we do this properly? There was a phrase that was going around in 2010 and 2011 that every company's a media company now. We're all publishers. Nobody really knew what that meant. So they were everyone was trying to get in on this action, and we weren't sure everyone was doing it right. We saw competitors popping up who we thought were just going after the dollar. There's several of us at Contently who are journalists, have been journalists. We care a lot about the profession. If you were with us earlier today at the Hillel, Glenn was talking about saving the industry and having something to pass on to the next generation. We take a bit of a different approach. We're trying to save the profession. We don't so much care who's producing the news and who's telling the story from an institutional standpoint. We're trying to create a model that perpetuates the role of the journalist and the profession of journalism out there. That's part of our mission, and it's in our bones. So as we did this, we started to encounter some big ethical questions. And there are two big ones right up front. Conflict of interest. Once you do this, is there any going back career-wise as a journalist? It's something we all faced when we took on this role at Contently and started striking deals with companies like American Express. Can I ever go back and be a straight journalist again? Work for Wall Street Journal and cover American Express? And the other was transparency. Is this advertising in journalism's clothing? Is it simply just product placement? And what are the minimum levels of disclosure the audience demands and we're obligated to provide? Then we explored some interesting, from an individual level, we began to explore some interesting ethical questions, like what happens when the brand edits my byline? Is it okay to scrub mentions of a brand's competitor? And do you need release forms from sources? It's something you never encounter as a journalist. You're at the scene of the fire and you capture the panic-stricken victim and the officer who's got the official scoop, and you don't need their permission. You're telling, you're witnessing something and you're capturing their witness. It's a different story, or is it a different story when, that quote is being used under the banner of marketing? So as journalists, we really cared about the answers to these questions, and brand publishing was an amazing source of income for us for journalists. We really were propelled and pushed forward by the rates we saw we could get journalists via working with these brand publishers, but we had to protect the careers of the journalists we were working with. We were also worried about our own careers. So our mission was to do this right, to see if, to look at, can we do this with or without brands, and to make sure we do it right. So we did something we often do at Contently, which is we report the problem. Like I said, there's several of us who are and were reporters. We love to take our notebooks out and actually get on the phone and report the problems. We will do rounds of phone calls with editors at newspapers and magazines. We'll talk to journalism professors, and we talk to the brands who are underwriting a lot of this. So we came up with the interesting, none of this is new, which was a bit new to me. This is the furrow, and this is probably my favorite example. It's certainly the oldest that we've been able to come up with. This is a publication that's been put out since 1895. If any of you grew up on a farm or know farmers, Art mentioned I'm from New Jersey, and that's the farthest thing from a farm you'll get. But if you know farms, the furrow is still produced in America and still well read among farmers. John Deere began putting this out in 1895, and their concept was that if they could publish content on farming and make farmers more efficient, make their yields grow year to year, they would consume more John Deere product. They would start buying more John Deere. Care for the audience, and they'll have more to spend on your product. It's a soft touch. If you look at this and if you go through old copies, there isn't a lot of hit you over the head branding that says buy a John Deere tractor. It's brought to you by John Deere, but the articles are on farming. This is an example I don't love, but this is a product of me not knowing I was going to be here today and dealing with slides Shane actually built the other day. So it's soap operas. It's, soap opera came about in the 1930s and 40s when soap companies came to radio programmers and said, we need to get in front of this audience. What's a format that will appeal to them and captivate them? And they developed soap operas, which all the research showed them housewives who were buying soap products, Tide and what's another soap? I don't know. I don't do the housework. They were going to be hooked on this product. Radio and television was born of content marketing in a way right from the start. It was launched by RCA, NBC and ABC were launched by RCA to sell radios. People weren't going to buy radios if there wasn't something to listen to, so NBC began broadcasting. Then there's this thing called custom publishing, which has been around for decades at least, maybe going back to the 30s and 40s. Every publisher I have ever worked for had a custom publishing unit that put out magazines like this, fully sponsored by US Airways, Ford, Marriott, whoever it is, engaging their audience and telling their brand story. This is a funny one because there really was rarely a question that this was unethical. Journalists were able to cross that line often, get a byline in a US Airways or a Destinations magazine, and still go back and keep their credibility and write for traditional publishers, Virginia Monthly or Southern Living. So these can be a little salesy. This is the worst of all worlds. This is the advertorial, and I don't even like grouping this in brand publishing. Advertorials are really just advertising with a lot of text. If you read through these are promotional, which for us, we think the promotional aspect, how much is it promoting the sponsor, is a big differentiator of when you step away from sponsoring the journalism or co-opting the journalism. And I don't know many journalists this is copywriting, I don't know many journalists who try to jump back and forth between this and traditional publishing. So we did some reporting on the transparency question. We started asking around, and we looked at could a writer accept work for Food and Wine magazine, which is owned by American Express? And the agenda there is that American Express assumes that if they promote the idea of fine dining and travel, a certain percentage of it will be done on American Express cards. A lot of people don't even realize Food and Wine is an example of this. Food and Wine, destinations, travel and leisure are all American Express products. They assume that a certain percentage of the population that enjoys those activities will do so on their American Express cards. They just need to promote the lifestyle. So we started asking around, could someone take a byline in Food and Wine and still expect to get a byline in New York Magazine? And the answer was, it's going to the dark side, as it used to be called. And the answer was, this has been done for a long time. We interviewed the associate managing editor for standards at the New York Times, who let us know that past connections or job would not pose an insurmountable conflict for someone otherwise qualified. You can tell that quote came from an email and was probably written and crafted over a few times. The truth is, conflicts of interest have always been inherent in journalists. It isn't just the work you take, it's who you are, what activities you engage in, who you're related to. This is Kara Swisher. Kara Swisher is one of the leading tech journalists in the world. She worked for years at the Wall Street Journal covering all the top tech companies, including Google, where her wife works. Now, this is on the site, All Things D. She lists her disclosures. She lets the audience know right out of the bat, my wife works for Google. We stand to benefit as Google benefits. Will that, judge me for what that's worth? I worked for a time at ZDNet, which is owned by CBS, and underneath our bylines were two links, one to our bio and another to our disclosures. And they were pretty stringent. They wanted to know mutual funds you were invested in, stocks you held, relatives you had working at companies. So the truth is, conflicts of interest have always been inherent in journalists. It's just about how we disclose them and whether or not you're creating a conflict. So we came up, give me a second, pardon me. So the qualifier is not whether or not you worked for a brand, it's whether you were good enough for the job at hand. And that's the answer we kept getting back from editors. They understand the market out there now. They understand journalists will take any opportunity they can to make a living. And by doing that, we're actually supplementing the journalism organizations, the news orgs, because we're keeping good journalists employed, keeping them fed and alive, and they are able to keep working for the New York Times and these companies that aren't able to carry salaries and freelance budgets like they used to. So as long as we've been very clear with our writers that they be very transparent, disclose everything, tell us who you're working for, and tell your editors who you're working for. So we've taken care of the conflict of interest. It's about disclosure and communication. It's about honesty. And it's been around for a long time and it's been managed. Next, we've got this transparency question. Is this advertising and journalism's clothing? The main tenets of journalism, and we talked about this earlier today, this is from SPJ. Seek the truth as fully as possible. Act independently. Seek to minimize harm and behave responsibly. Be accountable. It's our notion that at the end of the day, you can engage in brand journalism, brand publishing, and execute on all three of those. There's no way to act independently if you're operating as a brand publisher. Your objectivity may be questioned, but that doesn't mean that your integrity has to be. So at the end of the day, it all comes down to don't deceive. We're talking about credibility here, and we realize that for big brands who were aligning their corporate goals with publishing goals, they could not afford to, they couldn't trash their credibility. They're stepping into brand publishing to capture this audience that they used to have to rent on broadcasters and publishers. They now want to own that audience directly. Open Forum wants to own that audience directly on Open Forum instead of renting it from the Wall Street Journal, or All Things D, or BNet, or any number of small business sites. American Express can't act independently because they are who they are, and they're going to be clear about who they are. but it doesn't mean that they can afford to trash their credibility. The audience will walk right out the door. And it's kind of a nice media Darwinism that we believe keeps good actors performing well and will send the bad actors right out of the herd where they're eaten by some large animal. We saw a great example of this summer with Scientology. I don't know if I'm sure everybody heard about this one. The Atlantic Custom Publishing Unit published a story on how awesome the founder of Scientology is. At the very bottom of the story was some small print that let you know that the piece was paid for by Scientology. It wasn't an advertorial. It did not come with those blaring advertorial messages up top. It was run through the Atlantic's native ad unit and meant to look like the Atlantic's publishing house banner. And if there's one thing that Scientology doesn't hold a lot of credibility on, it's how awesome their founder is. The audience turned off right away. They surrendered any connection they had to that audience on the Atlantic's channel. It was also pretty damaging to the Atlantic and probably a terrible audience fit. I would not think the Atlantic is a good place to go trolling for Scientology members. So we started to ask the question, is this okay? Is it enough that the audience understands the objectivity isn't there and the publisher is still going after your credibility? And the answer we came up with is if it is journalism, no, that's not enough. If it's not journalism, it is okay. This is a quote from Bob Steele of the Janet Prindle Institute at DePauw, and he talks about the idea of news being information. And that's what we've come down on the side of, is that we're not supplanting the civic responsibility journalism that you see in the A section. We're talking about the information and entertainment factor that is publishing. This is the place where brand publishing needs to thrive. And when you think about it, this has been around for a long time. Magazines are, for the most part, information and entertainment. Vogue, Sports Illustrated, Details. Shane always slips a picture of Ryan Gosling in my slides. Maybe his wife does, I'm not sure. But when you look closely at the business and look closely at the content, the coverage is heavily driven by where the advertising money is coming from. In essence, Details magazine is a sponsored piece of publishing. It's just sponsored by a mutual fund of advertisers who all share some things in common. If you look at a lot of different publishers, you can always tell a theme running through who all the advertisers are, and it's no mystery that the publishing content tracks right alongside those advertisers. Would it be any different if Details were fully sponsored by Armani than sponsored by a mutual fund of advertisers? And I want to show you an example of what that looks like when the mutual fund is replaced by a single sponsor. So this is Porter Magazine. Porter Magazine is sponsored by Net-a-Porter, which is a luxury fashion brand. And they're putting out a product that is, if you look at it, it's as thick as a Vogue. If you open it up, the content is similar to Vogue, and it's almost as good. And for Net-Porter, it's a more profitable and efficient way to the audience. They've cut out this middleman that was Condé Nast, that was broaching this relationship with the audience through Vogue. They've got real editors, real reporters, amazing photography. They've got the whole package. There's not a lot of difference between this, GQ, and 17, other than the fact that it's paid for by a single advertising sponsor. And newspapers weren't acting much differently. You've got journalism with the capital J in the front of the paper, the A section. But a lot of newspaper revenue was sponsored by, as everyone knows, it's sponsored by the back section. And a lot of that is journalism with the lowercase j. It's this info and entertainment. It's the sports section, style section, home section, dining out section, and that, people are never going to sponsor the story about the orphanage fire on A1 or A2. They are going to sponsor the real estate section and the fashion section, which is what always supplemented the A section and the journalism with a capital J. So at the end of the day, we talk about blurring the lines, and what we've come away with after reporting it pretty thoroughly is that the lines were pretty symbolic at a lot of organizations anyway. Maybe this is where I remind you about to be skeptical and ask me a lot of questions later. So we came up with the idea that stories are stories. Good stories will always find an audience and need good storytellers to tell them. But we wanted to make sure we're doing it the right way. So we came up with a content marketing code of ethics, which does not look all that different from something like SPJ's. It adheres to journalism's core values of honesty, integrity, accountability, responsibility, things like crediting all sources and content ideas, ensuring that the reader and the viewer understands the source, the sponsor, and the intent of the content. We've come up with a phrase we throw around a lot, which is that objectivity trumps transparency trumps objectivity. You can no longer be independent, but you surrender your credibility if you are anything but transparent. So never deceive. Disclose all potential conflicts of interest right off the bat. And if the motive is clear, what matters is telling a great story. That's transparency, and at the end of the day, if you abide by those rules of deception and transparency and letting go of objectivity, it doesn't matter if you're a passionate journalist writing an op-ed for the Times or a brand producing a branded documentary. As to those pesky little questions we came up with earlier, what happens when a brand edits me under my byline? We started to have to answer questions like that, and we came up with, these are facing the individual journalists. We wanted to make sure they were not hung out to dry. So our code of ethics, which you can visit online, and we've tried to take a stance that this should be an industry-wide code of ethics, and Contently does not own this code of ethics. We're just, we kind of feel like we're good guys. We're hoping we're good guys, and we're making sure that the field operates correctly. So we're pushing this code of ethics. In our code of ethics, we say that the publisher must seek the journalist's approval first or remove a byline when they make substantive changes to an assignment. If they're inserting anything that changes, and we're not talking about things that change the accuracy, because we would never put our name on anything that changed the accuracy, and the brand can't do that, again, for the credibility purposes, but if they slip in anything promotional, we ask the journalist permission, or you take your byline off it. How do you deal with competitors? How do you deal with avoiding your competitors and writing a solid story about an industry and not having to promote the brand you're being sponsored by and not trashing or mentioning the competitors in the field? If you're transparent about your motives and that it's not journalism, I think the audience understands that. Disclose the conflicts of interest and don't deceive. We also enforce, I think anyone who's worked in a newsroom understands what editorial guidelines are. And we talk a lot to the brands about setting up editorial guidelines before they ever go to market with a brand publishing product. And one of the basic tenets is usually cover the fields in a way that you don't ever have to mention your competitors. If you make those rules right up, when I was at the Ladders, we made a rule that was we would never cover job board sites. We would never cover the efficiency of using job board sites to find a job. That way we got away with never having to talk about how awesome the Ladders was, never having to talk about how bad Monster or LinkedIn was. Do you need release forms from sources? Is it an editorial interview or is it marketing? And we be clear when we're talking to sources where the material is going. I'm reporting on behalf of American Express Open Forum. That's where this story is going. Are you okay with that? Whether or not the brands need sign off on this is an open question. We encourage everyone to be careful because I think at the end of the day, we're all coming down on the side of this is actually marketing. This is being used for marketing purposes, and I think all the legal mumbo jumbo applies there. Wanted to look at a few examples. Red Bull is really the big boy, becoming the big boy. American Express was, but Red Bull's really becoming the leader in brand publishing right now. They have over 2 million print subscribers. Anyone who thinks print is dead, Red Bulletin's putting out a monthly magazine and reaching 2 million people, and they see a lot of value in it. It's a free subscription. They use the mailing list for a lot of marketing purposes, but and if you haven't picked it up, it's really quite beautiful. They're doing a ton of different other things in the realm of publishing. Aside from sponsoring athletes, this is arguably the best documentary film about snowboarding, The Art of Flight. This is a reason Red Bull has been able to build a great following. They're 100% clear here about who's paying for this. But if you watch the video, there's no mention of how great Red Bull is. You're watching guys jump off stuff, and I think they're wearing some Red Bull gear while they're going through the half pipe. But Red Bull's quite clear about their intentions. They're hoping that those who live this lifestyle and thrive on it will seek out their product just to stay awake and hit the half pipe or whatever. American Express opened. This is one of Contently's babies and one of mine. We've been working on this one for a long time now. American Express Open Forum is spending millions of dollars a year on journalism. They are on individual journalists, putting reporters in the field to cover awesome small business stories. They recently embedded a journalist for 6 months in a startup to report the story of an entrepreneur coming to light. That's an expensive thing that a lot of publishers and newspapers can't afford to do. Story will never mention American Express. It's all about the lifestyle of being an entrepreneur. They understand that people who seek out this info and come here again and again a number of them will seek out American Express open cards as a means to run their business. You can see American Express is everywhere on the branding. They make no secret about who's paying for this. But the content is not about American Express. This is UPS again from the beginning. They're publishing via Forbes. UPS is another client of ours, and this Jeremy's been at Contently, one of the 30,000 from the early days. Jeremy's actually a professor of journalism at City University of New York. So if anybody's worried about ethical quandaries in journalism, it's journalism professors. So I think they can do a better job here, both in the terms of Forbes and UPS, of making it clear who's paying for this. But if you read stories like this on this UPS Voices channel, you'll find no stories about UPS. They're about people running their businesses and finding new efficiencies. UPS understands that if they cultivate that market of folks interested and really desperate to run their businesses better, they will, they're seeing the UPS on the side. They will seek out UPS. Enough of them will seek out UPS to make it worthwhile, and that's UPS's ROI. And that feels a lot nicer to me than the TV commercial where the guy ends by saying, "And that's why I use UPS." And there's a key ingredients to the success of all those, and anyone succeeding at brand publishing, and that's that they're audience focused. It's meeting people on their terms. It's not on the brand's terms. I think brand publishing has come out of the idea that the old marketing wasn't working. That was brands talking to the consumer. This is brands talking with the consumer about their lives and the way they experience the brand. It's not UPS telling you why UPS is awesome. It's UPS telling you how to help run a better business. And it's brought to you by UPS. It's not deceptive. Most profitable piece of brand publishing so far. This is the Lego Movie, and this falls in the category of the soap opera example from before. My slides might have been different than Shane's. I kind of, when it's a piece of fiction, it's different to me. But the concept is the same. This movie made $200 million last weekend. These are, the idea for Lego is that, they're really trying to sell toys. They're not trying to be a movie house. And I think that's something that, it's a lesson for brand publishers who should follow the same lead. They're not trying to, Red Bull isn't trying to sell 2 million magazines a month for the sake of being a magazine company. They're trying to sell 2 million magazines a month in order to sell cans of high energy poison. So, we close with, what happens to the ethics of journalism when the advertiser is the publisher, and we think that capitalism and the ethics of journalism align nicely. The media Darwinism plays a big role, and the concepts, the tenets, never deceive, focus on the audience, tell great stories. That's what brings an audience in. That's what the brands are after. When done right, and if done right, we all have a vested interest in making sure it is done right. These tenets can't be let go when just because the brand is paying for the media, the content, when the advertiser is the publisher. Thank you. Now, use the skepticism. Be kind to me. Happy hour awaits. But I want to open you up to questions.
I just have a question based on that last slide. You saying you choose something different. What would you choose to be the most successful example of brand?
I would probably use American Express. The way they went after that high-spending travel and dining market, travel and leisure, food and wine, and destinations. They've done that in such an artful and skillful way that very few people really have any idea that that's brand publishing. You'll never read that and think I'm being asked to sign up for an American Express card. But it's very clear, you open it up and it's the company is American Express Publishing Company. So that's where I would have gone. I also love the John Deere example. So I think it depends on. It is troubling in the sense that it should be very obvious. Brands have logos that people recognize, and if you open destinations, it says American Express Publishing, but I don't think the logo's there. That could be a step. But in terms of the objectivity and the transparency, they're not. Their agenda isn't so devious there. They aren't trying to sell you a credit card. They're trying to inform you and entertain you and get you to engage in the lifestyle. So it could be better. Yes?
So I guess I have a question that's about the other side of things. Like, who thinks that Vogue is in some way independent of the influence of advertisers and is somehow like a home for independent scrutiny of issues having to do with fashion? It's just like, who thinks that? It's like all magazines are products owned and run by advertisers. And as you say, like, it's either an individual advertiser
right.
or it's kind of a mutual fund of advertisers. But, Consumer Reports is a really unusual magazine because it doesn't have advertisers. And so there is a way in which, like, there's like one example that I can think of a magazine whose content I actually trust. But the rest of them, all of the rest of them seem to me to be, like, what's the big difference?
It's a good question. I talked about the mutual fund of advertisers supporting the publication, but sometimes it really is a single, I would work in magazines where they would decide to open a new section. And why did they open a new section? It was never because the audience demanded for it. It was because an advertiser came to them and said, "Hi, we're trying to reach a specific, we want to reach people who buy, big data storage systems. We're willing to give you."
Completely obvious when you're reading that section.
It is because the three, you create this new 4-page section, and there's 3 stories about data storage, and there's one advertiser, IBM, in there.
Yeah.
Yet, there is that line still there. The journalist, his job has just been created by IBM because the magazine just went and hired a new reporter to produce that material. But there's the middleman role that the publisher was playing. Once I started to think about it, the walls broke down for me, but I understood, the perception is still out there, and maybe it's more than a perception. It's, at some publications it's more of a reality than at others, but we approach journalists all the time who, refuse to participate in this kind of model. And good for them if they, I think few of us look a gift horse in the mouth so easily, when it comes to a paycheck. We all make decisions.
Could you please talk about transparency and the social media environment? Because we're getting our stories through social media, and if our friend or some trusted acquaintance sends it to us or likes it or refers it, then we believe it, but we may not know the source. How does that all work?
You don't know the source in the sense that you don't know who the original publisher of the info was?
See a byline, but you may not recognize that it's a brand writing the story.
Well, that's deceptive.
Right. Isn't that what happens, though, to the pieces that are being...
Not with the folks we work with. I mean, if it's on social media and it goes back to a link, all these folks are trying to own that audience. They don't want that link going back to something that's, subterfuge and, something that doesn't, you can't tell where it's from. You can't tell who published it. They want you to identify their brand with that piece of content. So it's not servicing them. It's not servicing the audience. The audience sniffs that stuff out. They stop coming back to that. That's clickbait. You're going to get one or two. You're going to get a flash in the pan spike in exposure when you get something that gets hot on social media but doesn't have any kind of brand recognition as a publisher. Someone might click on it once and 1 million people might click on it once, but they're not coming back.
How much is accuracy or being fact-based part of your effort?
So that's it's key. We right up there, number 1 or number 2 is that I will not produce anything that isn't fact-based and accurate. So that goes to the idea that it's not copywriting in that sense. That's where it really starts to break from journalism. Even though American Express is paying for it, if they're going to be writing about themselves, we won't produce anything that isn't accurate and fact-based. I don't think many publishers would find any benefit to it either. Contemporally, we go a step further, and we actually insist that everything be sourced. It's not just stated in the copy, but you're quoting a primary or a secondary source, and it's identified there in the content, and it's either identified by quotes or you can link to some other document and display right there where these facts are coming from.
John, my question is, when you interact with people who are in traditional journalism venues and you interact with people who are engaged in the brand publishing world, what's your interpretation of the level of acceptance by traditional journalists of what you're talking about? And is that in any way changing?
With staff journalists, it's still they're very resistant. And that's kind of understandable. They've got 9-to-5s. The freelance community has embraced this. There are holdouts, but for the most part, freelancers have embraced this model. And I think one of the things they've done is they've taken ownership of their own ethics. They will say, I'm going to accept this project, and I know I'm doing I'm producing objective journalism still. You know, they'll take the consequences on, you know, their marketability in the freelance market later. But there are very few, we're finding no resistance from publishers. We're finding no publishers who are saying, I won't work with a journalist who has previously accepted work from one of the brands in these industries they're covering. It's becoming more and more accepted. The travel industry has this old concept of the junket, where travel writers made their living by getting invited by tourism boards to countries or by resorts to come and hang out at the resort for the day. And the junkets, I think they were rarely ever, they never controlled the content. You were allowed to write whatever you wanted to. But a lot of publishers used to say, we won't work with folks who've taken junkets. The New York Times used to have a 3-year rule. If you had taken a junket within the last 36 months, they couldn't work with you. And that's still in place, but we're finding it disappear more and more. So publishers are understanding that their freelancers have to earn a living. They're looking at these publications and they're deciding for themselves which ones are appropriate and which ones aren't. I think it's become more of an individual question. Sure. Yeah, you. I don't know your names. Yep.
So the end of the article is still so that you buy the product. And so I wonder if everything I read now, or a lot of what I read more and more, eventually all I read is paid for so that I buy a product. Isn't that like really losing the independence and what actually, like maybe not entertainment journalism is about, but a great part of journalism is about, which is informing responsible citizens about the public and public issues, and then also maybe sometimes the interest of the company conflict with common good.
Yes.
It's maybe a good story still, but it's just a different story that's coming out there, and more stories that don't concentrate on good.
So yes, you surrender your independence. You know, they have an agenda which is to sell cans of Red Bull, and I think the audience has to understand that when they read that, and they're going to make their own decisions about whether they're going to trust this article about awesome kayaking locations or best skydiving gear. They're going to make their own decision about whether this is a credible source of information on skydiving gear, because I know the people paying for this want me to buy Red Bull at the end of the day. I don't think this is ever a model that's going to support what we would call civic responsibility journalism. Coverage of the courthouse and coverage of the state house and the police department and the fires and natural disasters. This is not, no brand's ever going to put their stamp, no one's going to want to sit next to that sad story. This model is not going to produce, this model is not going to make revenue for all types of journalism. It is a way to keep the profession going and a revenue model that we think has legs to keep journalists employed. But you do surrender your independence, but not your credibility. Thanks, Art. Thank you, guys.